We're going to talk about a paper you authored with Mario Villarreal with the title The Road to Crony Capitalism. I was intrigued by the title, and especially so when in the opening line of the paper you mention Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. Why? What is the relation between The Road to Serfdom and The Road to Crony Capitalism?
I have long been a fan of Hayek's Road to Serfdom, and I've defended it against people who claimed that he's making a slippery slope argument, which takes the form, well, if you have any kind of planning or regulation of prices at all, that means that you're going to become a fully socialist nation. And that's not what he says. What he says is that there's a tendency for power of the government to control and direct market processes, since it distorts things, to pile up on itself. Because once you introduce distortions, it takes additional regulations and other activities to redistribute or to try to solve those problems. So I have long thought that when people say that Hayek is making an extreme kind of slippery slope argument, that's not right. What he's identifying is a tendency. And that the state might well stop short of that, but we should be aware of the tendency for concentration of power. Now, I would connect that with something that I do, and I think a lot of pro-market people do. If I'm discussing with one of my colleagues on the left the idea of a socialist government, I'll say, well, look, clearly socialism doesn't work. Look at Venezuela. Look at Cuba. These are basket cases. They have no economic development. They're poor. And my socialist friends will say, oh, well, that's not real socialism. If you look at real socialism, it would work. So they have an idealized conception. I have discovered that people on our side are actually making some of the same kind of mistake. Because when a colleague on the left will look at Solyndra, which was a firm that was making solar panels, or if they'll look at the bailouts of Wall Street in the United States in 2007, 2008, they'll say, well, look, the government is just supporting these criminals, these people that are taking money from taxpayers. And I'll say, that's not capitalism. Well, wait, if there's a tendency for capitalism to move what some people call cronyism, then I cannot say, I can't defend an idealized conception of capitalism any more than my friends on the left can defend an idealized conception of socialism. What we have to do is look at those things as they actually are. So what I have become more concerned about with capitalism is something like the concern that Hayek had about a move to socialism. Does a capitalist economy in a democracy have a tendency to encourage business people to turn away from honest profit towards lobbying and rent seeking? And what the word crony means is it's a sort of a friend, but it's also a criminal. So crony capitalism means that top corporate executives and the government officials have a sort of illicit, corrupt relationship that may not be technically illegal, but it means that they use the institutions of the society to manipulate the process so that the government is putting its thumb on the scales to benefit its wealthy friends. And that's not competition. What I'm worried about is it may be capitalism.
So you think, well, first, could we further define crony capitalism? And then I want to ask you if this is one endogenous or part inevitable in capitalism to develop crony capitalism. What is it?
See, I've sort of changed my mind about the second question, but you're right, we should take the first question first. So capitalism is no unearned privilege. If I make profits, it has to be a sign that I have produced a product that people want to buy and that the price that they're willing to pay still allows me to cover all my costs of production and the opportunity cost rate of return on my capital. So profits in an honest system where I'm hiring engineers, I'm hiring salesmen, I'm trying to make better and cheaper products. If I'm making profits, it must be true that I'm increasing social value. Now, A crony capitalist system would be one where, at the margin, it becomes more profitable for me to hire lobbyists than engineers. And the reason that I'm skeptical and more pessimistic about this than I was is that I realize that there's a sort of simple result that investment might at some point imply it's going to be more profitable to hire the first lobbyist than the next engineer. So if I hire a lobbyist, it means that I'm trying to enlist the aid of government and its coercive
And what would be
force.
typical tools of cronyism, like let's say tariffs, licenses, permits?
Bailouts. So a lot of these have apparent public policy purposes. So we could, in my home state of North Carolina, there's 160 different professions where you have to have licensing. So it happens that you have to have 1,500 hours of education in order to be a hairdresser. You only have to have 900 hours to be an emergency technician on an ambulance. So, but what that means is it raises the entry barriers that protect the profits of these industries. So, but those are not real barriers, those are artificial barriers. So crony capitalism is when it becomes more profitable for businesses to enlist the aid of government to create these artificial barriers than it does to earn profits honestly by making better and cheaper products. What I worry about is that in a democracy, it's almost inevitable that that's going to happen.
Well, isn't it almost inevitable in almost any kind of system?
Sure, which means that when my colleagues on the left say, well, what about this? I can't say, oh, that's not capitalism. Because if capitalism actually tends in that direction, I think we, the pro-market people, need to take that criticism more seriously.
If it increases in relation to government power, would that be a fair thing to say? There's more opportunity for cronyism when there's more government power?
That's true. The reason I'm hesitating is that the sort of political science economics that I do is called public choice. One of the key assumptions of public choice is that we cannot assume good people are working for the government. The institutions of government have to control self-interest, just like the institutions of the market control self-interest. So let's assume that people who work for the government are themselves rationally self-interested. That means that they will be entrepreneurs, but entrepreneurs of the state aren't seeking profits, they're seeking power. So there's a tendency for government to grow. So I agree that this is a problem with the government, but that doesn't make it any less a pathology of capitalism in a context where government has these incentives to assert more power. So the interconnection of the institutions, the interlacing of the institutions is probably going to result in two things. One, business people are going to recognize that it's profitable for them to turn to the government for aid. I mean, if I'm getting killed, I'm losing money. Then I go to the government and I ask for subsidies, I ask for protections against my competitors because it's unfair. It can't be fair because they're charging lower prices and have a better product. I need help here. Well, would the state say no? Only if we can assume that the governors, the people who've been elected to the government, are good people in the sense they say, you know, this would benefit me electorally. I can get more votes, I can get more campaign funds, I can increase my power, but I'm not going to do it because it'll harm the country at large.
Okay, well, we assume that cronyism is like endemic to capitalism. It's bound to happen.
It's endemic to the capitalism that's embedded in a democracy.
Why is it damaging? What is the damage of cronyism?
The damage of cronyism is insidious because it means that there's less innovation, prices are higher, we don't see new products because we're protecting and reifying the existing industries. And one of the things that's hard to accept about capitalism is that creation is so destructive. It's absolutely true that Steve Jobs, when he invented the MP3 player, put 10,000 people at Sony out of work. You are old enough, you may remember the Sony Walkman, which was this square thing that you used to walk around listening to. They were pretty good, but they weren't as good as MP3 players. Sony lost $60 million and had to lay off 10,000 employees. Now, if you are a politician who comes from a district with a lot of Sony employees, you're going to be outraged. You're going to come up with a reason why the MP3 player, it should be licensed, we should have some long drawn out process to reduce the damage that it...
We haven't tested for the radiation. Yes.
We could have, that's absolutely right. Maybe it's got iridium in it. Who knows how dangerous this thing is? And the result is you can come up, people are creative, they can come up with some self-serving reason why helping their friends and harming their enemies is actually in the public interest.
It constrains innovation, and it will tend to reduce consumer choice, raise prices, right, and reduce competition. Yes. Is there any hope?
This is the thing that is sort of hard for me to say, because for a long time I've been an economic institutionalist. I'm a student of Douglass North, and the idea of institutions is it's hard to get them to change. So markets are usually embedded in some institutional context, and the reason I have such high hopes about markets is that they're dynamic. They introduce competition, they encourage new products, they allow new ways of doing things. But the public choice approach has long said that the first thing you should think about is not, we need better government. I'm afraid that's true. What we need is to do a better job in educating people about the importance of choosing legislative and presidential leaders that are concerned about the welfare of the larger country. We need to think about CEOs, corporate CEOs, that will do the moral thing instead of the legal thing. It's pretty difficult to go to a corporate CEO and say, it is actually legal for you to use lobbyists that try to approach the government and get favorable policy. But it's the wrong thing to do. You shouldn't do that. And I think for generations, there were a lot of people who worked for corporations that believed that. But as corporations have grown larger, and the pressure to increase the stock price every year has grown greater, the resort to say we're going to hire lobbyists instead of engineers is almost irresistible. So this is going to sound very old-fashioned. I think we need to take more seriously the task of emphasizing the character of leaders, the ethical basis of decision-making, both in economics and in politics. And I understand at some level we all say that's important, but it's usually not front and center in the way that we educate young people.
But also, don't you think, Michael, let's say from a legislative point of view, that we would try to reduce government's power to grant privilege? I was thinking of this in when they had this debate over where Amazon would establish its new campus, and they were sort of shopping around different cities to see which city would give them the biggest tax breaks.
It's an excellent example.
And actually, I was thinking, this should be illegal. Why should governments have the power to say, no, come do it with us and we won't tax you, and we'll tax everybody else more so we don't have to tax you? So isn't there a lot to do in that sphere as well?
Yes. What you're saying is you're expecting politicians to limit their own ability to make themselves better off.
Yes. You think that's a
tough
nut to crack?
It would be until we can reach voters. So one of the reasons that it's important to do this sort of show, and one of the reasons that I go around talking about this, is that if voters recognize that we need to have government limit itself, I think we can start to make progress then. Because if you grab a politician by his voters, he will follow. So we need to persuade voters that they need to limit that kind of policy. H.L. Mencken famously said that elections are advance auctions in stolen goods. So we're going to steal it, and whoever wins is going to get all the spoils. The Amazon was a perfect example, because they're going to take money from people who are already there, who are hardworking and are employing people in the community, and we're going to take their money and give it, in effect, to this new company.
Yeah. You think there should be more exposure of cronyism? I mean, I don't think it's something that's dealt with that much in the press and maybe even in academia. And how about measurement? Do we do any good measuring on this?
You asked two questions, and they're both good. The first is about how much we talk about it. Yes. People on the left talk about it all the time, but they're equating cronyism and capitalism. Our side needs to take up that challenge and say it isn't necessarily part of markets. it's actually a kind of government failure. When the government makes available favorable policies at a reasonable price, it's not surprising that business is going to buy it. But the government should not be in that business. And so the trying to reestablish more traditional capitalism by distinguishing cronyism and capitalism, by having us accept, yes, that's a problem. And measures of cronyism for years, the journal Public Choice and a number of other academics have tried to measure the proportion of, in the United States at least, gross national product that actually is devoted to rent seeking rather than to honest production of profits. So we might revive that, because GDP or GNP is just the total level of economic activity. Some of those things are productive and some are not. So if what you're talking about is the paying of licensing fees, that's not producing anything. If what you're talking about is producing new products, that's actually something that people can buy. So I think we need to focus on improving our ability to come up with these measures and publishing them in our journals, emphasizing the importance of that kind of work.
So when we started, Michael, we made reference to Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. You seem to imply that Hayek's intent was not necessarily to describe a slippery slope. Is crony capitalism a slippery slope?
I think that it's not. I think that just like the road to serfdom, there were turnarounds. And one of the reasons, because if Hayek thought it really was a slippery slope and it was inevitable, there's no point writing the book. You should just go get in a bunker and get a bunch of canned food. So he thought by writing this, and in some ways that's probably true. Margaret Thatcher explicitly used the Constitution of Liberty, saying this is our Bible, this is what our policies are, we can turn this around. So I think the road to crony capitalism, although it is steep and downhill and we're picking up speed, there's still some turnarounds. And so I hope that by making people aware of the ability that voters have to say, I don't want the sort of government that sells off favors. I want politicians who recognize that this is a problem, and they shouldn't be beholden to the interests of government. They should be, the capitalism really is about serving consumers, not large concentrated economic interests. So I think there are some turnarounds. I don't think that it's inevitable, but I think it's going to be kind of an uphill climb to go back in the other direction.
Well, thank you for joining us, Michael.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.